I never thought I'd be the kind of person who'd need a prenup. I guess no one does, right? We all think our love stories are different, special somehow. But looking back now, I wish I'd listened to that little voice in my head instead of his laughter. Where are you watching from today? Comment down below. My grandfather built our family business from nothing. Wilson Manufacturing started in his garage 50 years ago, and by the time he passed away, it was worth millions. I grew up watching him work, learning everything about the business, staying late after school to help with inventory. He'd always tell me, "Emma, someday this will all be yours. Take care of it like I did." When he died 3 years ago, I was devastated. He wasn't just my grandfather, he was my mentor, my hero. The business passing to me felt like both a blessing and a tremendous responsibility. I was only 27, suddenly at the helm of a company with 68 employees depending on me. People who'd known me since I was a little girl running around the factory floor were now looking to me for leadership. Those first 6 months were the hardest of my life. I worked 14-hour days, went to night classes for my MBA, and somehow managed to keep everything afloat. The business didn't just survive, it thrived. We landed 2 major contracts, and I finally felt like I was honoring my grandfather's legacy. That's when I met James. He came to a charity gala I was hosting for the local children's hospital. My company had donated a significant sum, and as the face of Wilson Manufacturing, I had to make an appearance. James was bartending, of all things. Not what you'd expect for a meet-cute with a future husband, but there was something about the way he smiled at me from across the room. "You look like you could use something stronger than champagne," he said, sliding me a glass of whiskey when I approached the bar. I laughed. That obvious, huh? Only to someone who's been watching you charm the room for the past hour while looking progressively more exhausted. His honesty was refreshing. Everyone else that night had been telling me how impressive I was, how much I reminded them of my grandfather. James just saw a tired woman who needed a real drink. We talked until the event ended, and he asked for my number. Our first date was the next weekend. Nothing fancy. Just dinner at a local restaurant. But James had this way about him that made me feel like the most fascinating woman in the world. After being consumed by business for so long, it felt incredible to be seen as just Emma again. James was charming, attentive, and passionate about photography. A hobby he was trying to turn into a career. He'd been between real jobs for about 6 months, picking up bartending gigs and the occasional photography assignment. He had dreams of opening his own studio someday, but admitted his finances were a mess right now. "I'm basically living paycheck to paycheck," he confessed on our 3rd date. Not exactly an impressive thing to tell the beautiful business owner across the table. His vulnerability was endearing. I'd spent so much time around people who only saw dollar signs when they looked at me that James's honesty felt like a breath of fresh air. He never asked about my money, never seemed intimidated by my success. If anything, he was my biggest cheerleader. Our relationship moved quickly. After just 2 months, James moved into my downtown condo when his roommate suddenly decided to move out of state. It was a practical decision, he said, and would give him a chance to save money while looking for more stable work. I was just happy not to come home to an empty apartment anymore. By month 5, I was introducing him to my executive team as my partner. By month 7, I was bringing him to family events, where my mother absolutely adored him. "He's so down to earth," she kept saying, as if that were the highest compliment she could give. Maybe it was. Then came month 8. We were having dinner at home. Well, my home that had become our home, when James suddenly got down on one knee. He didn't have a ring. "I wanted you to pick it out yourself." But his eyes were so sincere, so full of love as he asked me to marry him. Emma Wilson, these past 8 months have been the happiest of my life. I know it hasn't been that long, but when you know, you know. Will you marry me? I said yes without hesitation. The joy on his face, the way he spun me around the living room. It felt like everything I'd been working so hard for finally had meaning beyond just business success. I had someone to share it with. It wasn't until a week later, when we were discussing wedding plans, that the subject of a prenuptial agreement came up. I mentioned it casually, thinking it was just common sense given my position. We should probably talk to a lawyer about drawing up a prenup, I said. Just to protect the business. It's not just about me. There are employees whose livelihoods depend on Wilson Manufacturing. James's reaction caught me completely off guard. He laughed, not a gentle chuckle, but a dismissive laugh that made my stomach drop. A prenup? Seriously, Emma? Those are for people who don't really love each other. For people who are already planning their exit strategy before they even say I do. I tried to explain that it wasn't about not trusting him. It's just business, James. My grandfather built this company, and I'm responsible for its future. Do you think I'm marrying you for your money? His tone shifted from amused to hurt. Is that what you think of me? That I'm some gold digger who's going to take half your company if things don't work out? No, of course not. I backpedaled, feeling suddenly guilty. It's just standard practice for someone in my position. Well, it's insulting, he said flatly. We're building a life together, Emma. What's mine is yours, and what's yours is mine. That's what marriage is supposed to be. The conversation ended with me apologizing, and James forgiving me with a kiss that still felt somehow different. That night, I called my best friend Sarah to vent. I think I really upset James by bringing up a prenup, I told her. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Emma, don't you think things are moving a little fast? You've only known him for 8 months. When you know, I repeated James's words. And what exactly do you know about him? Sarah asked carefully. About his past relationships, his family, his credit score? Has he even found a steady job yet? Her questions irritated me. He's building his photography portfolio. These things take time. So do relationships, Sarah countered. I'm just saying there's no rush. And a prenup isn't an insult, it's protection. My sister got one before she married Rob, and they're perfectly happy. James isn't Rob, I said defensively. You don't understand how hurt he was by the suggestion. Maybe that's what worries me, Sarah said quietly. I changed the subject, but Sarah's concerns lingered in my mind. The next day, I had a meeting with our family lawyer, Mr. Bennett, who had worked with my grandfather for decades. He was reviewing some contracts for me when he casually asked about wedding plans. James and I are thinking spring, I said, trying to sound cheerful. Nothing too elaborate. Good, he nodded. And I assume you'll want to discuss a prenuptial agreement soon? Given the nature of your assets, we should start that process early. I hesitated. Actually, we've decided not to do a prenup. Mr. Bennett took off his glasses and fixed me with the same stern look he used to give me when I'd visit my grandfather's office as a child and try to take extra candies from his desk. Emma, your grandfather entrusted you with his life's work. Wilson Manufacturing supports dozens of families. A prenuptial agreement isn't about distrust. It's about responsible management of assets that affect many lives. James feels strongly that it sends the wrong message, I explained weakly. And how do you feel? He asked. I didn't have a good answer. The truth was, I felt torn. Part of me understood the practical necessity, but another part worried that pushing the issue would damage something precious between James and me. I strongly advise you to reconsider, Mr. Bennett said. At the very least, let me draft something for you to look over. Something fair that protects the business while acknowledging your partnership. I promised to think about it, but as I drove home that evening, I already knew what would happen. I'd choose James's feelings over business practicalities. I'd convince myself that true love didn't need legal safeguards. I'd ignore the warning bells because the alternative, that I might be making a terrible mistake, was too painful to consider. When I got home, James had prepared dinner, a rare occurrence, and opened an expensive bottle of wine. As we ate, he talked excitedly about wedding venues he'd researched and honeymoon destinations he was considering. His enthusiasm was contagious, and soon I was caught up in his vision of our future together. That night, nestled against him in bed, I made my decision. I wouldn't mention the prenup again. Mr. Bennett was from a different generation, I reasoned. Sarah was just being overprotective. James loved me for me, not my money. And wasn't that worth protecting above all else? If only I'd known then what that decision would cost me. If only I'd recognized that his laughter wasn't just dismissive. It was the first note in a symphony of red flags I chose not to hear. Looking back, I can pinpoint the exact moment I knew I'd made a mistake. It wasn't during our lavish wedding, which somehow ballooned from the nothing too elaborate I had envisioned to a 200-guest extravaganza at the Grand Hotel downtown. It wasn't during our honeymoon in Bali, where James insisted on upgrading to the private villa with its own infinity pool. No, it was 3 weeks after we returned, when I found him sitting in my office at Wilson Manufacturing, casually scrolling through company financial reports on my computer. "What are you doing?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light despite the unease creeping up my spine. James looked up with that disarming smile of his. "Just getting a feel for the business, honey. If I'm going to help you run this place someday, I should understand the numbers, right?" I hadn't realized James had aspirations to run my family's company. In fact, I distinctly remembered him saying he wanted to pursue his photography once we were married. "You've never mentioned wanting to be involved in the manufacturing side before." "Well, I've been thinking," he said, leaning back in my chair, my grandfather's chair, really, with a confidence that seemed new. "Your CFO is getting close to retirement age. With my background in finance." "You have a background in finance?" This was news to me. In the 10 months I'd known him, James had described his work history as various jobs in the corporate world before pursuing his creative passions. "I double majored in finance and photography in college," he said with a wave of his hand, as if this were common knowledge. "Anyway, I think I could bring a fresh perspective to the company. These investments here," he pointed to the screen, "are way too conservative. We could be making twice the return." I tried to ignore the warning bells ringing in my head. This was my husband talking about our future together, not some stranger trying to take over my company. But something felt off. "We can talk about it later," I said, reaching for my laptop. "I have a meeting with the production team in 5 minutes. James closed the files but didn't immediately surrender my computer. "Oh, by the way, I ordered some new equipment for my studio. Should be delivered tomorrow." "Your studio?" This was the first I'd heard of a studio. "Yeah, I leased that empty space on Elmwood Avenue. Perfect lighting, good location. I've been meaning to tell you." "James, that's a big decision to make without discussing it first. How much is the lease?" He finally stood up, kissing me quickly on the cheek. "Don't worry about it. We can afford it. What's yours is mine now, remember?" He winked and sauntered out, leaving me staring after him. That was just the beginning. Within 2 months of our wedding, James had developed an impressive array of expensive new hobbies. Suddenly, he was a wine collector, ordering cases from exclusive vineyards. He took up golf, insisting he needed custom clubs and a membership at the most prestigious country club in town. He traded in his sensible sedan for a sports car that cost more than what most of my employees made in a year. "Don't you think we should discuss these purchases?" I asked one night after a particularly extravagant delivery arrived. A rare watch he'd bought at auction. "Why?" James seemed genuinely puzzled. The business is doing well. We have the money. That's not the point. We should be making these decisions together, and some of that money should be reinvested in the company. James sighed dramatically. Emma, you work too hard. The business practically runs itself at this point. Your grandfather built something that will last generations. It's time you enjoyed some of the benefits. 6 months into our marriage, James announced he was quitting his part-time job at the local arts center, the only steady employment he'd maintained since I'd known him. I want to focus on helping with the family business, he declared over dinner. Photography can wait. Wilson Manufacturing is our future. I nearly choked on my wine. Our future? James, you've never shown any interest in manufacturing before we got married. That's not fair, he protested. I've always supported your work. And now that we're married, it's our company. I've got some great ideas for expansion. Expansion? The company was doing well, but we were still recovering from some major equipment investments my grandfather had made before he passed. We're not in a position to expand right now. That's because you're thinking too small, James said, reaching for my hand across the table. Your grandfather built this company by taking risks. When was the last time you took a real risk, Emma? The question stung because there was some truth to it. I had been conservative with the business, focusing on stability rather than growth. But that was because I felt responsible for all the families that depended on us. I'll think about it, I said, knowing even as the words left my mouth that I was setting a dangerous precedent. The next week, I discovered the credit card statements. I hadn't been checking them as carefully as I should have, trusting that James understood our financial boundaries despite his spending spikes. The total almost made me sick to my stomach. $48,000 in a single month. I confronted him that evening, spreadsheets and statements in hand. James, this is unsustainable. The photography equipment I understand, but these other expenses... James barely glanced at the papers. I've been entertaining potential clients for the business. That's how these things work, Emma. Your grandfather knew that. Relationships are everything in business. What potential clients? I don't see any new accounts. These things take time. You can't expect immediate results. He reached for the statements, gathering them into a neat pile. Look, I know money wasn't an issue when you were single, but marriage is about sharing everything, the good and the bad. What's yours is mine, what's mine is yours. Isn't that what we agreed? We didn't agree to unlimited spending without discussion, I countered, feeling my resolve strengthen. I need you to return the watch and cancel the country club membership. We need to set a budget. For a moment, I saw something cold flicker in his eyes, something I hadn't noticed before. Then it was gone, replaced by the wounded look I was becoming increasingly familiar with. You don't trust me, he said quietly. After everything, you still see me as some kind of gold digger. That's not what this is about. Isn't it? If I were bringing in millions, would you be questioning every purchase? Or is it because you still see it as your money, not ours? And there it was, the guilt trip that always seemed to end these conversations. I felt myself wavering, questioning my own judgment. Was I being unfair? Was I still thinking like a single woman instead of a wife? I just want us to be partners in these decisions, I said finally, softness replacing the firmness in my voice. We are partners, James insisted, pulling me into a hug. I'm sorry if I've been spending too freely. I just want us to have the best of everything. You deserve it after working so hard. I let myself be comforted, ignoring the uneasy feeling that had taken up permanent residence in my stomach. That night, as James slept peacefully beside me, I stared at the ceiling and wondered if this was what marriage was supposed to feel like. This constant negotiation between standing your ground and keeping the peace. What I didn't realize then was that there is no peace to be found when you're compromising who you are. And the doubt I was burying? It wasn't weakness or disloyalty. It was my instinct screaming a warning I couldn't yet bring myself to hear. They say the truth reveals itself in layers, like peeling an onion. For me, the final layers came off during what should have been the biggest success of my career. Wilson Manufacturing had been approached by Meridian Industries, one of the largest distribution companies in the country. They wanted to establish an exclusive partnership that would double our production capacity and create at least 30 new jobs. I'd been working toward this kind of opportunity since taking over the company, a chance to grow while staying true to my grandfather's vision of quality craftsmanship and employee loyalty. The negotiations had been intense but promising. After 6 months of meetings, contract drafts, and site visits, we were one signature away from closing the deal. I'd been transparent with James about the process, though he'd seemed oddly disinterested in what was happening. Now I understand why. The morning we were scheduled to sign the final contracts, I arrived at the office early to find Mr. Bennett waiting for me, his expression grave. "We need to talk, Emma," he said, following me into my office. "Meridian called me last night. They're pulling out of the deal." I felt like someone had knocked the wind out of me. "What? Why? Everything was finalized." Mr. Bennett placed a folder on my desk. They received alternative investment information from Wilson Manufacturing. Apparently, your company is pursuing a different strategic direction. "That's impossible," I said, flipping through the documents. "I never sent this." The folder contained proposals for diversifying Wilson Manufacturing into tech startups, cryptocurrency investments, and overseas manufacturing, none of which aligned with our company's values or expertise. Each proposal was signed with a digital signature: James Wilson, CFO. "James isn't our CFO," I said numbly. "He doesn't have any official role in the company." Mr. Bennett's expression softened with pity. "Emma, I think you need to look at your corporate accounts. Your husband has been quite busy." The next 3 hours were a nightmare of discovery. With our IT director's help, we tracked a systematic pattern of financial manipulation. James had been using my login credentials to transfer funds, small amounts at first, then increasingly larger sums, to external accounts. He'd created fake vendor contracts, set up shell companies, and made unauthorized wire transfers to investment firms specializing in high-risk ventures. In total, he'd diverted nearly $2 million over the past 8 months. "This is embezzlement," Mr. Bennett said quietly. "We need to contact the authorities." I sat frozen at my desk, staring at the evidence of my husband's betrayal. I need to talk to him first. I need to understand why. Mr. Bennett advised against it, but I insisted. This was still my husband, the man I'd chosen to build a life with. There had to be an explanation. I called James's cell repeatedly, but he didn't answer. Finally, I texted him, "We need to talk. It's urgent. Meet me at home." His response came instantly. "In meetings, all day." "Can it wait?" I replied simply, "No." When I arrived home, James's car wasn't in the driveway. I used my key to enter, half expecting to find the house emptied of valuables. Instead, everything looked normal. Eerily so, as if my world hadn't just imploded. I heard voices coming from the home office. James's voice, low and intimate, followed by a woman's laugh. For a moment, I stood paralyzed, my hand on the doorknob. Then I pushed the door open. James was sitting at the desk, my grandfather's antique desk that I'd moved from the office to our home, with his assistant Megan perched on his lap. They sprang apart when they saw me, James's face cycling through shock, guilt, and finally settling on defiance. "You're home early," he said, as if this were a simple scheduling mishap. "Clearly," I replied, surprised by the steadiness of my voice. Megan, I think you should leave. The young woman, who couldn't have been more than 25, grabbed her purse and hurried out, murmuring apologies I barely heard. When the front door closed, I placed the folder of evidence on the desk between us. Want to explain this? James glanced at the papers but didn't touch them. You weren't supposed to find that yet. The casualness of his response stunned me. Yet? You've been stealing from my company, James. You sabotaged the Meridian deal. Why? He leaned back in the chair, my chair, with a sigh that sounded almost like relief. The Meridian deal was small time, Emma. I found us better opportunities. Better? You've lost us $2 million and our most promising partnership. Those opportunities were scams, James. High risk, high reward, he corrected. Your problem is you think too small. Your grandfather built something decent, but it could be so much more. My grandfather built a company that supports dozens of families, I said through clenched teeth. A company that makes quality products people rely on. He wasn't interested in get-rich-quick schemes. James rolled his eyes. And that's why he topped out where he did. Look, I admit I moved faster than I planned, but once we turn these investments around... We? There is no we in this anymore, James. The clarity of that statement hit me with surprising force. You stole from me. You betrayed my trust. You've been lying since the day we met. Something hardened in his expression. Don't be dramatic. What did you expect? That I'd be content playing house husband while you run your little factory? I have ambitions too, Emma. Ambitions that apparently include emptying my bank accounts and sleeping with your assistant on my grandfather's desk. The pain was there, but distant somehow, like watching someone else's tragedy unfold. Megan understands me, he said, as if that explained everything. She sees my vision for what Wilson Manufacturing could become. Vision? I laughed bitterly. Is that what you call fraud now? It's only fraud if it fails, he countered. Give the investments time. Some of them are already showing promising returns. I walked to the window, needing distance between us. How long have you been planning this, James? Was it from the beginning? Was any of it real? For the first time, he looked uncomfortable. I did love you, Emma. I still do, in my way. But when I realized what we could accomplish together, your resources, my vision, it seemed wasteful not to act. My resources, I repeated softly. That's what this marriage was about, wasn't it? Access to my money. James stood, approaching me with his hands outstretched. It doesn't have to be like this. We can still make this work. I'll be more transparent about the investments moving forward. We'll make decisions together. I stepped back. There's nothing to discuss. I want you out of my house by tonight. The company lawyers will contact you about returning the money you stole. You're overreacting, he said, his conciliatory tone vanishing. Those funds are joint assets now. We're married, remember? What's yours is mine. The prenup I never insisted on loomed in my mind like a ghost. He was right. Legally, this would be messy. Without clear separation of assets, James could claim entitlement to company funds as my spouse. The thought made me physically ill. Get out, I said quietly. Now. You'll regret this, he warned, grabbing his jacket. Without me, you'll just keep playing small, safe Emma for the rest of your life. After he left, I sat at my grandfather's desk, running my fingers over the polished wood he had cared for so meticulously. I thought about his legacy, not just the business, but his integrity, his commitment to doing things the right way. I thought about how easily I'd compromised those values for a man who saw them as weaknesses to exploit. That evening, I called Mr. Bennett. I want to file for divorce, I told him, and I want to press charges for the embezzlement. Are you sure? He asked gently. This will get messy, Emma. Without a prenup. I'm sure, I interrupted. Whatever it costs, whatever it takes, I need to make this right. Not just for me, but for everyone who depends on Wilson Manufacturing. As I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not just anger or heartbreak, but a strange sense of relief. The scales had finally fallen from my eyes. I could see James for what he truly was, and more importantly, I could see the strength in myself I'd been doubting for too long. The road ahead would be difficult. But for the first time since my grandfather died, I felt worthy of the trust he'd placed in me. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but sometimes justice is sweeter when it comes as a complete surprise to the person who never thought they'd face consequences. I'll never forget the look on James's face when he was served with divorce papers at his new apartment, the one he'd rented with my money, furnished with my credit cards. According to the process server, he'd opened the door wearing a silk bathrobe I'd never seen before, a glass of expensive scotch in hand. Mr. Wilson looked like he'd seen a ghost, the server told me with a slight smile. Asked me 3 times if there was some mistake. There was no mistake. After discovering the full extent of James's financial manipulations, I'd spent 2 weeks working with Mr. Bennett and a team of forensic accountants to document everything. The divorce filing included charges of financial fraud, misappropriation of company assets, and breach of fiduciary duty. We'd frozen all joint accounts and credit cards, changed the locks on both the house and the company offices, and revoked every access credential James had ever had. His response came within hours. A barrage of texts and voicemails ranging from confused to furious. Emma, there's been a huge misunderstanding. The first voicemail said, his voice gentle and reasonable. Call me back so we can talk about this like adults. By the 6th message, the mask had slipped entirely. You ungrateful bitch! After everything I've done for you and that failing company, you'd be nothing without me. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I focused on saving my grandfather's legacy while preparing for what Mr. Bennett warned would be an ugly legal battle. Without a prenup, he can claim he contributed to the company's growth during your marriage, Mr. Bennett explained. He'll demand half of everything, not just personal assets, but potentially company shares as well. He can demand whatever he wants, I replied more calmly than I felt. But I won't give up. James hired Gregory Palmer, a divorce attorney notorious for his aggressive tactics and exorbitant fees. Their initial settlement demand was staggering. 50% of all personal assets, 40% of Wilson Manufacturing shares, and continued access to company resources for James's ongoing business ventures. He's delusional, I told Mr. Bennett when we reviewed the demand letter. Unfortunately, without a prenuptial agreement, he has legal grounds to claim marital property rights. Mr. Bennett reminded me gently. We can fight, but you should prepare yourself for significant losses. I was prepared to fight with everything I had. What I wasn't prepared for was the unexpected ally who emerged from my grandfather's past. It happened during a routine meeting with our company accountant, Elaine Morris, who had worked for my grandfather for over 30 years. We were reviewing financial records to document exactly how much money James had diverted when Elaine suddenly went quiet, staring at her computer screen. Emma, she said slowly, have you ever heard of the Wilson Family Trust? I shook my head. My grandfather set up several trusts for tax purposes, but I don't recall that specific one. That's because it's not a tax vehicle, Elaine explained, turning her screen so I could see. Your grandfather established it the day after you told him you were dating James. The trust document appeared ordinary at first glance, but as Elaine scrolled through, I began to understand its significance. My grandfather, without saying a word to me, had created a protective structure that placed 75% of Wilson Manufacturing's voting shares into an irrevocable trust. The trust had specific provisions that would activate under certain conditions, including attempted misappropriation of company assets by marriage or coercion. He knew, I whispered, a lump forming in my throat. Somehow he knew this might happen. Elaine nodded, her eyes misty. Your grandfather was an excellent judge of character. He noticed things about people, and he was determined to protect you, even if you couldn't see the danger yourself. The trust had remained dormant until now, but with documented evidence of James's financial misconduct, we could activate its protective clauses. The shares would be locked down, immune from divorce proceedings as they technically belong to the trust, not to me personally. When Mr. Bennett reviewed the trust documents, he let out a low whistle. "This is masterful," he said, shaking his head in admiration. "Your grandfather built a fortress around the company, designed specifically to withstand the exact situation you're facing." "Will it hold up in court?" I asked. "It's bulletproof," he assured me. "The trust was established before your relationship with James, fully documented and legally executed. Palmer can fight all he wants, but he won't break this." We activated the trust provisions immediately. The next day, I received a furious call from Gregory Palmer. "What kind of game are you playing?" he demanded. "These trust documents weren't disclosed in your financial statements." "We've only just discovered them ourselves," I replied truthfully. "My grandfather was very thorough in his estate planning." "This is obstruction," Palmer threatened. "We'll see what the judge has to say." The judge, as it turned out, had quite a bit to say, none of it favorable to James. Not only did she uphold the validity of the trust, but she also took a dim view of James's documented financial misconduct. "The court finds compelling evidence of systematic fraud and misuse of marital assets by the respondent," Judge Harris stated during her ruling. Furthermore, the Wilson Family Trust was properly established years before the marriage and contains valid protective provisions that this court will honor. James sat stone-faced as the judge continued, dismantling his claims one by one. The company was protected. My personal assets would be divided, but James would receive none of the business holdings he'd coveted. Even more satisfying, the judge ordered him to repay the diverted funds, with interest. "Your Honor, my client has no means to repay those amounts," Palmer argued desperately. "The alleged funds were invested in legitimate business opportunities that simply haven't matured yet." "Then your client should perhaps pursue legitimate employment," Judge Harris replied dryly. "The court's ruling stands." Outside the courtroom, James approached me, his handsome face twisted with rage. "You think you've won? This isn't over, Emma. Those investments will pay off, and you'll regret not being part of them." "The investments were scams, James," I said quietly. "The FBI has already frozen most of those accounts. There's nothing coming back." For the first time, I saw genuine fear flash across his face. The FBI? This was a civil matter. "Embezzlement is a criminal offense," I reminded him. "Mr. Bennett suggested we let them know what we found. They were very interested." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You can't do this to me. Without access to those accounts, I have nothing." "You should have thought of that before you stole from my company and betrayed my trust," I replied, no longer feeling any of the love or loyalty that had once blinded me. "Goodbye, James." In the months that followed, I rebuilt what James had damaged. Wilson Manufacturing recovered, eventually securing an even better partnership than the Meridian deal. I implemented new financial protocols designed to prevent anyone, including myself, from having unilateral access to company funds. Every major decision now required multiple approvals, creating a system of checks and balances my grandfather would have appreciated. As for James, I heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd been forced to sell his sports car, designer watches, and other luxury items to pay legal fees. His photography studio closed within weeks of the divorce finalization. According to Sarah, he'd moved to a neighboring state and was working as a sales associate at an electronics store. It was almost a year to the day after our divorce when my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Something made me answer instead of letting it go to voicemail. Emma? James's voice was softer than I remembered, missing the confident edge that had once seemed so charming. Please don't hang up. I said nothing, waiting. I've been doing a lot of thinking. He continued into the silence. About us, about what happened. I made mistakes, terrible mistakes. But what we had was real, at least for me. I've changed. If you could just give me another chance. Another chance to do what, James? I asked, surprising myself with how little emotion his voice stirred in me now. To steal from me? To lie to me? To destroy everything my family built? I was wrong, he insisted. I see that now. We could start fresh. I've learned my lesson. I thought about that moment years ago when he'd laughed at the idea of a prenup. How different my life might have been if I'd recognized that laugh for what it was, the sound of someone who believed consequences were for other people. Goodbye, James, I said, and ended the call. I blocked his number, then walked to my grandfather's desk, now back in its rightful place in my office at Wilson Manufacturing. On its polished surface sat a framed photo of him standing proudly outside the factory on its opening day, decades ago. Beside it, I'd placed the trust document that had saved his legacy. You knew, I whispered to his smiling image. You saw what I couldn't see. Maybe someday I'd trust someone enough to share my life again. But if I did, I'd do it with my eyes wide open, with boundaries firmly in place, and with a prenuptial agreement signed without hesitation. Some lessons are too valuable and too costly to learn twice.